It was a sunny afternoon in downtown, the streets buzzing with the usual midday energy. People huddled in groups, chatting and laughing, while cars honked impatiently as they tried to squeeze through the narrow lanes. Among the crowd, a black woman named Amara, confident and graceful, walked alone. She was dressed in a sleek, dark green jacket and high heels that clicked sharply against the pavement. Her presence was magnetic, not just because of her beauty, but because she carried herself with a strength that was palpable. As Amara made her way through the street, her phone vibrated, and she glanced at it briefly. It was a message from her manager checking in on an upcoming event. She smiled, tapping out a quick reply, completely unaware of the figure watching her from the corner of her eye. Officer Miller stood across the street, his eyes narrowing as he observed Amara. A man of authority, known for his heavy-handed approach, Miller had a reputation for making assumptions. As Amara walked past, he adjusted his uniform, straightening his posture. There was something about her, the way she carried herself with such confidence, that seemed to bother him. Maybe it was the way she moved, or perhaps the high-end clothes she wore. She didn't seem to fit the stereotype he had in his mind of what someone like her should be. His grip tightened around the radio on his belt, his eyes following her every step. Suddenly, without warning, he crossed the street, his boots stumping against the pavement. "Excuse me, ma'am." His voice boomed, cutting through the noise of the busy street. Amara froze mid-step, turning around, her heart skipping a beat as she saw the officer approaching. "Yes?" she asked, her voice steady but cautious. "I need to see some ID," Officer Miller said, his tone cold. Amara was taken aback. She wasn't sure what had triggered this encounter, but she didn't respond with panic. She had learned over the years to stay calm in these situations. "Is there a problem, officer?" she asked, maintaining a firm but respectful tone. "I said, I need to see some ID." Nab Miller repeated, his eyes scanning her face with a look that was part suspicion, part authority. There was no explanation, no polite inquiry, just a demand. Amara's grip tightened around her purse, a twinge of unease creeping into her chest. She wasn't used to being treated this way. She had every right to ask what this was about, but she had also learned from experience that questioning too much could make things worse. She slowly reached into her bag, her fingers brushing against the smooth leather of her wallet. But before she could pull it out, she heard the sound of footsteps behind her. A voice, calm yet filled with an unmistakable authority, called out, "Everything okay here, officer?" Amara's eyes flickered with a sense of relief as she turned to see the two figures stepping forward. They were tall, broad-shouldered, and exuded an aura of silent power. They wore dark suits that fit perfectly, their faces serious but composed. These were not just any men. They were her bodyguards who had been with her for years. Always vigilant, always aware of her surroundings, they were trained to handle situations like this one. Officer Miller's face tensed, clearly not expecting the backup. His hand hovered near his belt, where he kept his baton. "Who are you?" he asked, his voice now tinged with frustration. "We're her security," one of the bodyguards said, his voice measured and calm. "Now, I'd appreciate it if you'd explain what this is about." The officer hesitated for a moment, clearly thrown off balance by the sudden presence of the two men. The street seemed to hold its breath, the bustling noise around them fading into a tense silence. "Is there a problem, officer?" the second bodyguard asked, his voice low but firm. His eyes were fixed on Miller, unwavering. Miller's gaze flickered between Amara and her bodyguards, uncertainty creeping into his expression. He had clearly expected an easy encounter, one that would reinforce his power. But now, with two well-trained bodyguards standing between him and the woman he was trying to intimidate, the balance of power had shifted. The air felt thick with tension, and the crowd on the street seemed to slow down, as if everyone was waiting to see what would happen next. Would the officer back down? Would Amara's bodyguards defuse the situation, or would it escalate further? Before anyone could say another word, the officer's radio crackled to life, cutting through the tension. His eyes darted to the device, and for a moment he seemed distracted. It was enough time for Amara to glance at her bodyguards, a silent exchange passing between them. But as the officer turned back to face them, his expression darkened and the atmosphere shifted again. The tension was far from over. What would happen next? Would Officer Miller let his pride get the best of him? Or would the bodyguards handle the situation with the professionalism they were known for? And what if this encounter was just the beginning of something much bigger, something that would lead to a series of unexpected events? The answer hung in the air, unanswered, as the screen faded to black. Amara stood there, her eyes locked with Officer Miller's, but she was no longer focused on him alone. The sound of the radio in his hand crackling again seemed to hang in the air like a warning. Something was off. She could feel it in the pit of her stomach. It wasn't just the officer's condescending tone or the subtle flex of his authority. It was the way he was eyeing her bodyguards, the quick, almost imperceptible glance he shot them before looking back at her. Something about that look felt deliberate. Her bodyguards, Eli and Marcus, stood silently by her side, their faces unreadable. They were both ex-military. Eli, the older of the two, had seen combat overseas, and Marcus, younger but equally sharp, was a former tactical officer. They had protected her through countless high-pressure situations, but this felt different. Officer Miller's presence was unnerving in a way she couldn't quite explain. As the radio crackled once more, the tension thickened, stretching between them like a wire pulled too tight. Officer Miller shifted on his feet, seemingly uncertain of how to proceed. His fingers twitched, hovering over the radio's buttons, as if he were deciding whether to make a call or back off. Amara glanced at Eli, who gave a barely noticeable nod, one that she knew meant, "Don't move, stay calm." She wasn't sure how much more of this she could take. The incident felt like it had started out as an ordinary traffic stop, but with every second that passed, it was escalating. Why had the officer singled her out? It wasn't the first time she had faced prejudice or harassment in public spaces, but the way this situation had unfolded felt different. This was more than just an isolated incident. She could feel the weight of something darker looming just beneath the surface. Behind her, Marcus took a small step forward, adjusting his stance so that he could block her from view just a little more. It was subtle, but it was enough to show the officer that the situation was not something to be taken lightly. Miller cleared his throat and spoke again, his voice carrying more weight now. "I'm just doing my job. If you've got nothing to hide, there's no reason to make this complicated." His words were loaded, the implication clear. He was trying to assert control over the situation, and Amara could feel the pressure mounting. Her grip tightened around her purse again, but she remained calm, even as a rush of thoughts flashed through her mind. The officer was trying to bait her into reacting. He wanted her to step out of line so that he could justify his actions. But she wasn't going to give him the satisfaction. Not today. "What exactly am I being accused of?" Amara asked, her voice soft but unwavering. Miller's jaw tightened as he shifted from one foot to the other, clearly uncomfortable under her gaze. "Just routine checks," he muttered, his eyes darting from her to the bodyguards. "You know, with all the things going on in the city lately, we need to be more thorough." "Thorough." Eli echoed, his voice low and calm. "That's not an answer, officer." The officer bristled but said nothing. Instead, he began fiddling with the radio again, like he was stalling for time. His hand trembled slightly. Amara caught the small movement, and a chill ran down her spine. She had seen this behavior before, when people were trying to hide something, when they didn't have a solid reason to back up their actions. And then, just as quickly as the radio had cracked earlier, the voice from the speaker cut through the moment. "Officer Miller, you there?" The words were cold, clipped and distant, but the way they hung in the air suggested urgency. Miller's expression shifted. His face went pale, and for a second, Amara could have sworn he looked like he'd just been caught doing something he shouldn't have. His fingers fumbled with the radio as he answered, his voice shaking more than he realized. Yeah, I'm here. What's going on?" The voice on the other end was too muffled for Amara to make out, but she could hear the strain in the officer's response. He was caught off guard, like he hadn't expected this kind of interruption. "Just stay calm, okay? We'll be there in a minute," the voice said. Miller's expression hardened as he turned his back to Amara and her bodyguards, a subtle movement that told them all they needed to know. Something was happening, and it wasn't good. He was distracted now, but not in a way that made him less dangerous. If anything, it made him more unpredictable. Amara exchanged a look with Marcus, who didn't say anything but subtly shifted his weight, ready to act if things went south. Ailey, always the cautious one, kept his eyes trained on Miller, studying every movement, every breath. Then the officer spoke again, his tone now measured, almost too controlled. "You're free to go," he muttered, but his words were laced with an underlying threat that neither Amara nor her bodyguards missed. "Just stay out of trouble." Amara wasn't fooled. The way he said it, the way his eyes flickered with something unreadable, it felt like a warning, not a dismissal. But she didn't respond, not immediately. Instead, she took a deep breath and turned to leave, signaling for Eli and Marcus to follow. Just as she was about to step away, a shout from behind her broke the moment. "Hey, hold up!" The voice came from one of the officers standing a few yards away. This wasn't the same officer who had approached her. This one was younger, but his tone was just as aggressive. Amara's heart rate spiked. The situation was far from over. Eli stepped forward before anyone could react, positioning himself slightly in front of Amara. "What's the issue now?" he asked, his voice calm but firm. The young officer hesitated, glancing at Officer Miller before stepping closer. "I need to see your ID too," he said, his eyes darting between the bodyguards and Amara. "You're with her, right?" "That's enough," Marcus said, his voice a quiet warning. "If you have a legitimate reason, we'll cooperate. Otherwise, we'll be on our way." For a moment, the air crackled with tension. The young officer opened his mouth to speak, but then seemed to think better of it. The scene felt like it was teetering on the edge of something that could explode at any moment. But no one made a move. Everyone was waiting for the other to make the first mistake. And in the distance, sirens wailed. The sirens grew louder as they approached, the sound now cutting through the tension in the air like a blade. Amara's heart thudded in her chest as she instinctively took a step back, her bodyguards instinctively moving with her, positioning themselves between her and the officers. The crowd that had gathered on the sidewalk, previously minding their own business, now watched intently, their gazes shifting between the officers and Amara. Whispers started to rise, and some people pulled out their phones, undoubtedly recording the scene. Officer Miller's gaze flickered nervously toward the flashing lights in the distance. He turned back to Amara and her bodyguards, but there was no longer the smug sense of control he had earlier. Instead, it was replaced by something else, anxiety, even fear. He seemed to be waiting for something, but what? The young officer, still hovering behind Miller, shifted his stance. He looked like he wasn't sure what to do next. He'd been part of this team for a while, but clearly he hadn't encountered a situation like this before. Amara caught the subtle hesitation in his movements, and for the first time she saw a flicker of doubt in his eyes. But Officer Miller, trying to salvage what was left of his authority, took a step forward. "Get out of here," he snapped at the younger officer, his voice sharper than before. "I'll handle it." The young officer hesitated, but then nodded, stepping back quickly. The older officer turned his attention back to Amara, his eyes narrowing. "You shouldn't have pushed me," he muttered under his breath, though the words were more for himself and for her. Amara didn't respond. She knew better than to provoke him further, but inside her mind raced. Something was off, and she couldn't shake the feeling that this encounter was not just a random case of police harassment. The way the officers had acted, the uncertainty that had seeped into Miller's behavior. It was as though there was something more to this than a simple traffic stop. She glanced at her bodyguards, their eyes sharp, reading the situation just as she was. The sound of approaching vehicles broke the uneasy silence. 2 police cars screeched to a halt a few feet away, their doors slamming open almost in unison. 3 more officers stepped out, all wearing the same cold, emotionless expressions that reminded Amara of wolves circling their prey. They looked at Miller, then at her bodyguards, and finally at her. One of them, a woman in her early 40s with short, salt and pepper hair, surveyed the situation with a practiced eye. She didn't speak immediately. Instead, she took a moment to assess, her gaze lingering on Amara for longer than seemed necessary. There was something in her eyes, a flicker of recognition, maybe even surprise. Miller cleared his throat awkwardly, the confidence that had once been so evident now slipping away. "There's nothing to worry about," he said, his voice much quieter than before. "Just some routine checks. She's free to go." The woman officer, Sergeant Hayes, as her badge read, raised an eyebrow, clearly not convinced. She didn't take her eyes off Amara. "Routine checks," she repeated, her voice laced with skepticism. "For what exactly? She hasn't broken any laws." Miller shifted uncomfortably, clearly caught in his own web of lies. He opened his mouth to respond, but was interrupted by a sharp sound, like a low growl escaping from Ellie, who had stepped forward just slightly, his body tense. "We're done here," Eli said firmly. "This harassment needs to stop now." Sergeant Hayes' eyes shifted to Ellie, her gaze calculating. It was clear she had her doubts about the situation, but she wasn't quite ready to take action. Instead, she turned to her fellow officers, exchanging a brief look with them. A silent communication that Amara couldn't read, but instinctively felt was significant. A few tense seconds passed before Hayes spoke again, her voice calm but sharp. "I think you should come with us, miss," she said, addressing Amara directly. "We need to clear up some things." Amara felt her chest tighten. This wasn't just about a random stop anymore. "Clear up what exactly?" she asked, her voice more steady than she felt. The surgeon's eyes flickered briefly to the bodyguards before returning to Amara. "There's been a situation," she said, her tone not offering much explanation. "We need to talk." Amara could feel the gravity of the words hanging in the air. The sirens continued in the background, and though she couldn't see the flashing lights through the crowd, she knew that the officers were already preparing for something bigger. A situation? What situation? Her mind raced, piecing together the puzzle that didn't quite fit. This wasn't just harassment. This wasn't just an overzealous officer with a chip on his shoulder. Something had triggered this, and it went beyond her appearance, or the way she carried herself. Her phone buzzed in her pocket again, and she caught a glimpse of the screen. Another message from her manager. "Stay safe," it read, with no further explanation. It was a simple message, but the timing of it felt eerie. Was it a coincidence, or was it somehow connected to what was happening now? The bodyguards exchanged a brief look, both men standing at the ready to intervene if necessary. Amara felt their silent protection like a shield around her, but even that couldn't shake the sense that something far larger was looming. The second officer from earlier, the young one, returned to the scene now, but he was no longer standing with the same bravado he'd had when he first approached. His shoulders were slumped, and he kept his gaze averted, clearly uncomfortable. Amara couldn't help but wonder, was he regretting getting involved? Or did he know something they didn't? Before she could ask him anything, Sergeant Hayes took a step closer. "We're not here to make this difficult, but you need to come with us," she said, her voice much softer now, though still carrying an undeniable edge of authority. Amara's mind raced. She had dealt with confrontations like this before, but nothing felt as heavy as this moment. She was caught between two choices: cooperate and risk being dragged into something she didn't understand, or refuse and risk the situation spiraling out of control. But just as she was about to speak, a new voice broke through the tension. "Leave her alone." The words rang out clear and forceful, and for the briefest moment, everyone on the street turned to look. At the end of the block, a tall man in a sharp suit was walking toward them, his stride deliberate. The crowd parted, and the officer's eyes followed him. It wasn't just anyone. It was someone Amara recognized. A powerful ally, someone she hadn't seen in years, and someone who would change everything. The man in the sharp suit moved toward them with purpose, cutting through the crowd like a blade. He wasn't just any bystander. He was someone powerful, someone Amara had worked with in the past. Her mind raced as she recognized him. but she couldn't quite grasp the significance of his presence in this moment. Why was he here? Was this coincidence, or had he been watching from the shadows all along? Sergeant Hayes' eyes immediately flicked to the man, her posture stiffening as if she just realized the gravity of the situation. Her gaze softened, but only for a moment, before she quickly masked it with professionalism. "Can I help you, sir?" she asked, her voice cool, but with an edge of uncertainty. There was no mistaking it. This was a person with influence, and Hayes knew it. The man stopped a few feet away from Amara and her bodyguards, his presence commanding attention. His sharp, tailored suit exuded authority, but there was something else in his expression. A quiet determination. His eyes locked with Sergeant Hayes's, and the two exchanged a brief, intense look. The kind of glance that spoke volumes without saying a word. The tension between them was palpable. Whatever was happening, he was involved, and it was clear that things were about to change. "I'm here for Miss Amara," the man said, his voice deep and steady. "I suggest you let her go. Now." The words hung in the air, laced with an authority that made it clear he wasn't asking for permission. He wasn't just some lawyer or bystander. He was someone who had the power to back up his words. Amara's heart skipped a beat. She didn't know exactly who he was to the officers, but she could see that his mere presence was enough to throw them off balance. Sergeant Hayes stiffened, her jaw tightening. "This isn't your business," she replied. But there was no conviction behind her words. She knew she was treading dangerous ground now, and the fear was starting to show. Amara could see the cracks in her composure. The man didn't flinch. He simply took a step forward, his gaze never leaving hers. "I'm making it my business," he said, his tone unwavering. "This is escalating far beyond what you understand. You're treading into territory that's already been claimed." There was a pause, and in that silence, Amara could feel the entire street holding its breath. The officers around them seemed to hesitate, unsure of how to proceed. The crowd watched, some people still recording, others whispering among themselves. The sirens, now almost deafening, rang in the background, but the scene felt eerily quiet. Every second stretched into eternity, the tension hanging so thick it could almost be touched. The young officer, who had been standing back earlier, exchanged a glance with Sergeant Hayes. He looked lost, as though he didn't fully understand the gravity of what was unfolding. His eyes darted nervously between the man in the suit, his superior, and Amara, but he said nothing. Eli, who had been watching the entire exchange with narrowed eyes, took a small step forward, positioning himself protectively in front of Amara. Marcus, ever vigilant, mirrored his actions. The bodyguards were ready for whatever came next, but even they seemed unsure of what the man in the suit had planned. It wasn't a show of force they were used to, it was something else, something more dangerous. Amara felt her pulse quicken, her mind racing. What did the man know? What was his connection to this? And why had he waited until now to intervene? She wanted to ask, to demand answers, but something told her that this moment wasn't the time for questions. Not yet. "Move her," the man in the suit said, his voice low but commanding. His eyes locked on Sergeant Hayes again, and this time she didn't respond with defiance. She simply stood there, her posture stiff, as if she had just been forced to confront a reality she didn't fully comprehend. There was a shift in the air, a crackling tension that seemed to electrify the space between them. Amara felt her bodyguard step closer, the protective barrier between her and the officers growing even more pronounced. The officers seemed to hesitate, exchanging looks that suggested they were no longer sure of themselves. They had been in control up until now, but this new player had turned the tables. "You're wasting time," the man in the suit continued, his gaze unwavering. "Every second you delay is a second you don't have. Let her go. This is bigger than you." Sergeant Hayes took a small step back, her eyes flickering with uncertainty. For the first time since this ordeal had started, she seemed unsure of herself, unsure of her role in this unfolding drama. It wasn't just the man's authority, it was something more, something about the situation itself, something she wasn't prepared to confront. And then, without warning, the sound of a car engine revving broke through the tension, and 2 more police vehicles pulled up. But these weren't just ordinary officers. Amara's breath caught in her throat as she recognized the vehicles. They weren't marked with standard police decals. They were black, unmarked, sleek, and intimidating, and they came to a screeching halt in the middle of the street. The door of the first vehicle opened, and a figure stepped out. A tall woman with sharp features, dressed in a black tactical suit. Her eyes scanned the scene quickly, and without saying a word, she walked directly toward the man in the suit, stopping just a few feet away from him. The two exchanged a brief, knowing glance before the woman turned to Sergeant Hayes. "You're out of your depth," she said, her voice cold and authoritative. It wasn't a threat. It was a statement of fact. The air around them seemed to grow colder, the tension reaching a boiling point. Amara's stomach churned, the sense of unease growing as she tried to make sense of everything happening around her. Who were these people? Why had they arrived? And what did they want with her? Sergeant Hayes, clearly rattled by the new arrivals, took a step back, her hand instinctively reaching for her radio. "We're getting backup," she muttered under her breath. But there was no certainty in her voice anymore. The man in the suit, however, didn't move. He remained calm, his expression unreadable. "No need for more backup," he said quietly. "This is already over." Amara's pulse pounded in her ears as she watched the scene unfold before her. It was clear now that the situation was spiraling, moving beyond anything she had anticipated. The man in the suit, the black vehicles, the sudden shift in power, it all pointed to something bigger, something far more dangerous. And as the officers stood frozen, uncertain of what to do next, she realized she was caught in the middle of something much larger than herself. The clock was ticking, and every second felt like it could be her last.